My name is Matt, and I am 28 years old. The events that fundamentally changed my life and my understanding of safety took place exactly 3 years ago, during a time when I was living completely alone. I resided in a very small, older house situated on the absolute outer edge of our town. The property was incredibly isolated, and its defining feature was the backyard, which backed up directly to a massive, dense stretch of woods. This wasn't the kind of forest people visited for weekend recreation. There were no public hiking trails, no clear paths, and no signs of human activity across its 15 square miles of rugged terrain. In the entire year I had lived in that house, I had never seen a single soul venture into those trees, and I firmly believed that nobody ever went in there. I was not what you would call a traditional dog person back then, as I preferred the quiet predictability of a solitary lifestyle. However, that indifference vanished completely late one night when I stepped out onto my front porch to clear my head. Sitting right against the wall of the house, huddled tightly next to the front door, was a dog. She was a Border Collie, and she looked utterly devastated. The poor animal was shaking uncontrollably from a mixture of cold and pure terror, and her ribs were visibly showing beneath her matted fur. Feeling an immediate wave of pity, I went back into the kitchen, gathered a bowl of fresh water and some leftover food, and brought it outside. She devoured the meal instantly, though she remained extremely hesitant and skittish every single time I attempted to step closer to her. I assumed she belonged to a family in a nearby neighborhood and had simply run away, expecting her owners to come searching for her at any moment. I sat on the porch with her for about an hour, trying to offer some silent comfort when she suddenly perked her ears up, bolted off the wooden deck, and vanished into the pitch-black night. That was my very first encounter with her, but it was far from the last. Over the course of the following month, a bizarre and heartbreaking routine established itself. Every single night, without fail, I would step onto my porch and find the exact same Border Collie lying there, waiting for food and shelter from the cold. I tried calling local animal care services to come and rescue her, but she possessed a supernatural awareness. She would always flee into the darkness long before the operators ever had a chance to arrive at my house. Eventually, the wall of fear she had built up began to crumble. She started trusting me enough to venture past the threshold, and one evening, she finally walked completely inside my home. I kept her safe in the living room overnight until the rescue team could arrive the following morning to check her for a microchip. But when the time came to go to the vet's office, seeing how terrified she was of the world, yet how safe and calm she felt whenever she was right next to me, I realized I couldn't let her go. Right then and there, I officially signed the adoption paperwork, named her Grace, and brought her back to my house as my permanent companion. The first day was filled with a sense of relief. I kept a close eye on Grace as she slowly acclimated to her new environment, exploring the quiet rooms and finding comfortable spots to settle down. She was still noticeably skittish around sudden movements, but she was doing exponentially better than the feral, trembling creature I had discovered on my doorstep weeks prior. When night arrived, I created a comfortable nest for her out of a pile of thick blankets in the corner of my bedroom. Exhausted from the emotional weight and activity of the day, I crawled into my own bed and fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. My peaceful rest was brutally shattered in the middle of the night at precisely 2 in the morning. I woke up abruptly to the sound of loud, aggressive knocks echoing through the hollow structure of my house. I sat upright in bed, my heart instantly racing as adrenaline flooded my system. The first thing I noticed in the dim light was Grace. She had completely abandoned her bed and was cowering in the furthest corner of the room, shaking violently with the exact same paralyzing terror she had displayed on the very first night I met her. The heavy knocking on the front door downstairs did not stop. It was persistent, rhythmic, and demanding. I was incredibly sleepy and confused, trying to comprehend what any human being could possibly want at my doorstep at such an ungodly hour. Gripping the banister, I walked down the stairs and approached the heavy wooden front door, noting that Grace refused to leave the bedroom to follow me. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the small glass peephole, looking out onto the illuminated porch. To my confusion, the porch was completely empty. There was no one standing under the light. But just as I was about to convince myself that it was a neighborhood prank, I saw a dark shadow move along the perimeter of the house. Someone was creeping along the far side of the porch, right by the large living room window. I stood frozen by the door as I realized the intruder was leaning directly against the glass, cupping their hands around their face as they desperately tried to peer inside the dark house. Fear completely paralyzed me, preventing me from walking over to the window to confront the person face to face. I remained anchored to the safety of the front door, tracking the subtle movements of the shadow from a distance. After what felt like an eternity of silent watching, I finally heard the faint scuffle of footsteps moving away from the side of the house and retreating into the yard. I never got a clear glimpse of the person's face or clothing, which made the entire encounter feel incredibly violating and intensely creepy. To ensure that whoever it was didn't decide to circle back and attempt another entry, I remained downstairs in the dark for a long time, watching the windows and listening to the night. By 2:30, with the property remaining completely silent and showing no further signs of movement, I finally made my way back upstairs to the bedroom. Grace appeared marginally calmer than before, but her body was still visibly shaken by the intrusion. I climbed back into bed, locking my bedroom door behind me, and managed to drift back into an uneasy sleep until the morning sun finally brought a false sense of security back to the property. That terrifying night was the only time I ever received an active visitor at my front door, and as the days bled into weeks, I never received an answer as to who the stranger was or what they were trying to accomplish. However, the terror did not truly leave my house. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Grace began to exhibit a series of strange, highly disturbing episodes that reawakened all of my underlying paranoia. My backyard was completely enclosed by a sturdy wooden privacy fence, and usually when I let Grace out to stretch her legs, she would act entirely normal, wandering around and exploring the grass. But suddenly, without warning, she would stop dead in her tracks. She would turn her entire body to face the thick, black woods that loomed just past the edge of the fence, and she would completely freeze. This behavior occurred almost exclusively at night, right before I prepared to go to bed. I would stand on the back porch or look through the window, scanning the tree line with intense focus, but my human eyes could never perceive anything out there in the dark. Despite my inability to see the danger, Grace would remain completely frozen in place, sometimes standing perfectly still for several agonizing minutes. She would stand in the dead center of the yard, her gaze locked onto the pitch-black void of the woods, completely ignoring the sound of my voice when I called her name. She wouldn't even allow me to gently pull her back toward the safety of the house. Her muscles would be so locked with fear that she felt like a heavy statue. Every single time this happened, I would have to physically walk into the yard, lift her heavy, trembling body into my arms, and carry her across the threshold because she was so profoundly shaken and terrified by whatever she was sensing in those trees. After this exact sequence of events repeated itself enough times, I could no longer rationalize it as simple trauma or a dog imagining things. I knew with absolute certainty that Grace was sensing a physical presence out there in the dark, and that whatever was lurking just beyond my fence line was actively scaring the hell out of her. The true depth of that horror, however, wouldn't fully reveal itself until exactly 15 days after I had officially brought her into my home. Exactly 15 days after I had officially welcomed Grace into my home, the mysterious tension that had been building up in my backyard finally reached its breaking point. It was late at night, and I went to the kitchen window to watch Grace after letting her out into the fenced yard for her usual pre-bed routine. Just like the previous nights, she abruptly stopped in the middle of the grass and froze, her entire body locking up as she stared intently at the pitch-black woods. Looking through the glass, I felt an immediate shift in the atmosphere, A cold wave of dread washed over me, telling me that tonight was fundamentally different from the rest. Before I could even process that uneasy feeling, Grace did something she had never done before. Instead of remaining frozen, she suddenly bolted across the yard with incredible speed, cleared the wooden privacy fence in a single leap, and vanished completely into the dark forest. Panic instantly took over my mind. Without giving myself a single second to think about the dangers of entering a 15-square-mile wilderness alone at night, I grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight from the counter, ripped the back door open, and ran out into the trees after her. The moment I stepped past the property line, the darkness of the woods seemed to swallow me whole. I scrambled through the dense undergrowth, branches scratching at my clothes as I frantically swept the flashlight beam through the pale tree trunks. After running blindly for a short distance, the light finally caught the faint silhouette of Grace standing further ahead in the trees. I desperately called her name and hurried toward her, but as soon as I drew close, she turned and sprinted deeper into the wilderness. This agonizing pattern repeated itself over and over again. Every time I managed to catch up to her, she would look back at me briefly before running further into the dark, copywriting her movements to stay just close enough to keep me following her. It felt as though she wasn't running away from me, but was deliberately luring me toward a specific destination deep within the forest. By my estimation, we had sprinted nearly 2 grueling miles through the unmapped terrain before Grace finally came to a permanent halt. As I approached her, gasping for breath and shivering from the cold, I raised my flashlight to see what had caused her to stop. The bright beam cut through the mist and illuminated a structure hidden directly behind her. It was a small, incredibly run-down, and decrepit wooden shack or cabin that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. A wave of absolute terror hit me, and my instincts screamed at me to turn around and run back to my house. But looking at Grace, who was standing steadfast by the structure, I realized she had guided me to this exact location for a reason. I thought this hidden place might finally give me the answers to where she had come from, and why she had been so terrified on my porch all those weeks ago. Steeling my nerves, I stepped up to the decrepit structure and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The ancient metal hinges let out a loud, piercing creak that seemed to resonate violently through the silent forest, making my heart leap into my throat. I stepped inside the dark space, sweeping my flashlight across the interior. The shack was completely empty except for one horrifying detail located against the far wall. There was another dog, a completely different, much smaller breed than Grace, tied tightly to the structure. The poor animal was lying down on the filthy floorboards, shaking violently and radiating the exact same paralyzing terror that Grace had displayed when I first found her. Seeing the helpless creature, I immediately rushed over and worked quickly to loosen its restrictive collar until it easily slipped out of the restraint. Even though I had freed the animal, my mind was racing with absolute confusion and fear regarding who could have built this place and why they were keeping animals tied up in the middle of nowhere. I turned away from the small dog to look back at Grace, desperate to see how she was reacting. She was frozen completely solid near the doorway. I urgently called her name, but she didn't flinch or turn her head toward me. Her gaze was locked entirely on the dense trees outside, staring out into the pitch-black void. Then the oppressive silence of the forest was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. In the distance, coming from the direction of the deep woods, I heard the clear, unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves, walking steadily toward the shack. The owner of the cabin was returning. Knowing I was trapped 2 miles out in the wilderness with no protection, panic entirely took over. Without a second thought, I lunged forward, scooped Grace up into my arms, and bolted out of the wooden structure into the night. The small, freed dog immediately kept pace, running right alongside me as we tore through the trees in the general direction of my property. Carrying Grace was physically exhausting, and after running frantically for about half a mile, I finally had to set her down on the ground. Thankfully, her survival instincts kicked in, and she was able to run on her own 2 feet as we navigated the rest of the dark trek back. We sprinted with everything we had left until we finally burst through the tree line and crossed the safety of my fenced backyard, slamming the house door shut behind us. Once inside the locked house, I looked around and realized that the smaller dog had vanished somewhere during the final stretch of the chaotic chase through the woods. However, I felt confident that the animal had successfully escaped the stranger's clutches and had likely run off to find safety in one of the neighboring developments further down the road. Still trembling from the encounter, I immediately picked up my phone and dialed the police. A group of police officers arrived at my home later that night to take my detailed report, and they organized a formal search party to investigate the deep woods the very next morning. When the authorities eventually located the wooden shack, they found it completely abandoned, even more so than when I had stood inside it hours prior. There were no dogs left behind, and the mysterious individual who had built the shelter had packed up and vanished completely into thin air. Ultimately, the police were never able to identify the stranger or uncover what kind of illegal operation was taking place out there in the dark. Despite the lack of legal closure, the horrifying ordeal brought an unexpected peace to my home. In the days and weeks that followed that frantic night, I noticed a dramatic change in Grace's behavior. She never experienced another one of those freezing episodes in the yard again, and she completely stopped showing signs of fear when looking at the forest line before bed. Piecing the whole puzzle together, I realized that Grace must have known that terrifying man and possessed an innate ability to sense whenever he was drawing near to my property. Almost every single night during that first month, the stranger had been creeping out of the 15-square-mile forest, approaching my backyard fence under the cover of darkness and causing Grace to freeze in absolute terror. I firmly believe he was actively looking for an opportunity to steal her back from me, a fate I would have never allowed to happen. Now, 3 years later, Grace is doing absolutely wonderful and has become the most incredible companion I could have ever asked for. I will likely never discover the full truth about what was happening in those deep woods behind my property, but a lingering thought always stays with me. If I hadn't possessed the courage to run into the dark after her that night and expose that hidden shelter, that predator would have continued to haunt my windows every single evening, and things might have ended in a tragedy for both me and my dog.